The fire in the grate at 221B Baker Street had settled into that perfect state of being, not the aggressive crackle of new-caught flame, but the steady amber glow of coals that had found their rhythm and meant to keep it. The kind of fire that asked nothing of you, except, perhaps, that you sit nearby and let your thoughts drift where they would. Rain tapped at the window panes in that patient, persistent way rain has in London, as though it had been falling since the city's first stones were laid, and intended to continue until the last one crumbled. The sitting room smelled of coal smoke and old leather, of the bergamot from the tea Mrs. Hudson had brought up an hour earlier, and underneath it all, that particular scent of a room well lived in, paper and pipe tobacco, and the ghost of yesterday's toast. Watson sat in his chair with the Sunday paper spread before him, though he had read the same paragraph 3 times without absorbing a single word of it, which seemed entirely appropriate for a Sunday. His mind had that pleasant, unfocused quality of a man who has nowhere to be and no particular urgency about anything, a rare and precious state for a former army surgeon who had spent years answering to bugles and emergency calls. Across from him, Holmes held his violin loosely, bow dangling from long fingers, his grey eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance that existed, as far as Watson could tell, somewhere between the ceiling and eternity. He had played a few notes an hour ago, something meandering and minor-keyed, and then simply stopped, holding the instrument as one might hold a cat, present but uncommitted. Then Holmes's gaze sharpened, just slightly, focusing on the window where something small and ginger had just appeared on the outer sill, peering in with that expression of faint disdain that only cats can truly master. Mrs. Hudson's voice drifted up from somewhere below, firm and decisive in that way she had when she'd made up her mind about the shape a day ought to take. A proper Sunday, that's what we're having. No talk of corpses at the table, Mr. Holmes, and you'll eat something besides thinking, if you please. Her footsteps on the stairs had the rhythmic certainty of a woman who had climbed them 1,000 times and would climb them 1,000 more, each step a small claim of domestic order against the chaos her lodgers so often invited through the door. London, beyond the windows, had that muffled, muted quality it took on during steady rain. The usual cacophony of street vendors and carriage wheels and hurrying footsteps had softened to something almost gentle, as though the city itself had decided to observe the Sabbath with unusual sincerity. Even the church bells, when they had rung the hour earlier, had seemed to hang in the wet air longer than usual, each toll stretching out like honey poured slowly from a spoon. It was the sort of day that made a man grateful for a roof and a fire, and the particular comfort of knowing he was exactly where he ought to be. Watson set down his paper, admitting defeat to the paragraph that refused to be read, and reached for his teacup, finding it still pleasantly warm. Mrs. Hudson seems quite determined about this, he observed mildly. She is a force of nature, Holmes replied, his voice carrying that particular tone of amused respect he reserved for their landlady. And I suspect she's quite right. The criminal classes are presumably also taking Sunday off, or at least one hopes they have the decency to do so. He finally set the violin down with careful deliberation, as though releasing a bird he'd been holding. Though I confess, Watson, I find idleness more exhausting than the most complex case, The mind, left to its own devices, becomes tediously self-referential. Then perhaps, Watson suggested, with the gentle patience of long friendship, we might consider this an exercise in the underappreciated art of doing nothing particularly well. Holmes's mouth quirked in something that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't quite not one either. You always did have a gift for making virtue of necessity. The cat on the windowsill meowed, a small, polite sound that nonetheless carried clearly through the glass. It was a ginger Tom, well-fed and confident in the way of London cats who had learned to navigate the city's complex social geography. Watson recognized it, vaguely as belonging to someone in one of the nearby houses, though precisely which house escaped him at the moment. What did not escape him, however, was the rather peculiar detail of the ribbon tied around its neck. Not the usual collar one might expect, but a strip of deep blue silk, and hanging from it, catching the dim light, a small seal of dark red wax. Holmes, Watson said, his tone shifting just slightly from comfortable observation to mild curiosity. "Do you see?" "The cat," Holmes said, already rising with that sudden fluidity of movement that always surprised Watson, as though a statue had decided to become Mercury. "Yes, more specifically the ribbon, and most specifically the seal." He moved to the window with the focused attention he brought to everything once his interest was genuinely caught. Now that is irregular. The irregularity of a cat wearing a wax seal was, Watson had to admit, rather difficult to dispute. Cats wore many things in London: collars, bells, the occasional bow tied by an overly sentimental owner. But sealed messages were generally the province of more conventional postal methods. Holmes opened the window carefully, letting in a gust of cool, rain-scented air, and one slightly damp, entirely unbothered cat, who stepped onto the windowsill and then down onto the floor with the air of someone making an expected social call. "Good afternoon," Holmes addressed the cat with perfect seriousness, crouching down to examine the ribbon without touching it. "I see you've been entrusted with a delivery, though whether you're aware of it is another question entirely." The cat, for its part, sat down and began washing one paw, supremely unconcerned with the detective's scrutiny. Watson rose and crossed to join them, looking down at the small red seal. It was roughly circular, pressed into wax that looked relatively fresh, certainly applied within the last few hours. The design was simple, what appeared to be a small bee, rendered with surprising delicacy for such a tiny space. "A bee," he said, stating the obvious, because sometimes the obvious needed stating. "A bee," Holmes confirmed, his long fingers hovering over the seal without quite touching it, as though he could divine its secrets through proximity alone. "Pressed with intent, tied with care, and attached to a cat who, I would wager, belongs to Mrs. Hendricks 3 doors down, based on the particular shade of ginger and the small scar on his left ear from an encounter with a territorial rival last spring." "Should we remove it?" Watson asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Not yet," Holmes said, straightening. "First, let us observe. The ribbon is silk, good quality, but not exceptional. The wax is sealing wax, the sort available from any decent stationer, though the colour is slightly unusual, more burgundy than the common red. The seal itself is quite deliberate, the bee is well defined, suggesting either a professional seal or a very steady hand with a heated implement. And the cat." He paused, looking down at the animal, who had finished with his paw, and was now regarding them both with placid yellow eyes. The cat is entirely unperturbed, which suggests this was not a traumatic experience. Someone he knows, perhaps, or at least someone who approached with suitable feline diplomacy. Mrs. Hudson appeared in the doorway bearing a tray with fresh tea and what appeared to be currant scones, still warm and fragrant. She stopped, surveyed the scene. 2 grown men and 1 cat arranged in a loose triangle in the middle of her sitting room, and sighed with the particular patience of someone whose life had become, through no fault of her own, persistently peculiar. "That's Mrs. Hendricks's marmalade," she observed, setting the tray down with practised efficiency. "Don't suppose he's here about the mice, though he's welcome to them if he is." "He's wearing a sealed message," Watson informed her, because it seemed the sort of thing their landlady ought to know about the traffic through her premises. Mrs. Hudson leaned slightly to look, hands on her hips, then straightened with a small shake of her head. "On a Sunday," she said, as though this were the most irregular part of the entire situation. "Can't even have a peaceful tea without mysteries walking in on 4 legs. Will you be needing anything for the cat, or shall I just add him to the census?" "I think perhaps some cream," Holmes said, his tone absent, in that way that meant most of his mind was elsewhere, turning over the puzzle. "And if you could send Billy round to Mrs. Hendricks to ask if she's missing her cat, and whether she knows anything about his unusual accessory, I would be grateful." "I'll send Billy," Mrs. Hudson agreed, "but I'll not have you missing your tea over a cat and a bit of wax. Sit, eat. Whatever mysteries you're collecting, they'll wait 10 minutes for you to be civilized about it." There was no arguing with Mrs. Hudson when she used that tone. Watson had learned this years ago, and even Holmes, for all his occasional disregard for social convention, recognized the immovable object when he encountered it. They sat, somewhat obediently, and Watson poured fresh tea, while Holmes continued to regard the cat, who had now settled himself on the hearthrug and appeared to be falling asleep, the small red seal rising and falling gently with his breathing. "It's quite deliberately placed," Holmes mused, accepting his teacup with the distracted air of a man performing an action his hands knew well, while his mind was occupied elsewhere. "Not simply tied on as a prank, but carefully attached. The ribbon goes through a small loop in the wax. You can just see it if you look closely, which means the seal was made with the ribbon already present. Planned, intentional." "But why?" Watson asked, which was usually the right question with Holmes, who loved a good why the way some men loved a good wine. "Why indeed?" Holmes replied, and in those 2 words Watson heard the shift, the subtle change from idleness to engagement, from the exhausting nothing of a Sunday afternoon to the energizing something of a puzzle beginning to take shape. The day had turned, gently and without announcement, from properly boring to curiously irregular. And outside, the rain continued its patient drumming, and London kept its secrets the way it kept its soot, abundantly, and with very little intention of giving them up without persuasion. The morning had deepened into that particular quality of early afternoon that Sunday seemed to stretch like taffy, pulling the hours longer and softer than they had any right to be. The rain had not stopped. London rain in October rarely had the courtesy to simply stop. But it had settled into a steady, methodical pattern, the sort that suggested it had found a comfortable pace and intended to maintain it indefinitely. The The sky beyond the windows remained that uniform grey that made it impossible to say whether it was 1 o'clock or 3, whether the day was advancing or simply circling itself in contemplation. Holmes had, after Mrs. Hudson's firm encouragement and an entirely respectable consumption of scones, carefully removed the sealed ribbon from Marmalade's neck. The cat had submitted to this with regal tolerance, accepted the promised cream with more enthusiasm, and then departed through the still open window with the air of someone who had completed their assigned task, and now had other appointments to keep. Billy had been dispatched to Mrs. Hendricks and returned with the information that yes, Marmalade had been missing since breakfast. And no, she had absolutely no knowledge of any ribbon or seal. And would Mr. Holmes please stop encouraging the cat's wandering habits by feeding him? The ribbon now lay on Holmes's desk, the small red seal still attached, the bee captured in wax looking no less mysterious for being removed from its feline courier. Holmes had examined it with his lens, held it to the light, touched the wax with a careful fingertip to test its consistency, and then set it aside with the satisfied air of a man who had extracted what information it had to offer and was now waiting for additional data points to emerge. Watson had learned, over their years together, that this was often how Holmes's mind worked, not in great leaps of singular deduction, but in patient accumulation, gathering small facts like a man gathering kindling, waiting for the moment when he had enough to build something with. Watson had returned to his newspaper, this time with better success, making his way through an article about proposed improvements to London's sewage system. Not the most riveting of subjects, but written with enough bureaucratic earnestness to be oddly soothing. He was just reading about the merits of improved drainage in Southwark when Mrs. Hudson's voice drifted up from below, engaged in what sounded like a spirited discussion with someone at the door. A moment later, her footsteps on the stairs, and then she appeared in the doorway with a small parcel in her hands and an expression of mild exasperation. "This just came," she announced, holding the parcel as though it might contain something volatile, which, given the nature of items that sometimes arrived at 221B, was not entirely unreasonable. "Delivery boy says it's for Mr. Holmes, but there's no proper address on it, just the street number and the detective. I told him that's no way to send parcels in a civilized city. But he said that's what was written, and he's just following instructions." Holmes rose with immediate interest, crossing the room to accept the parcel. It was small, perhaps the size of a book, wrapped in brown paper and tied with ordinary string. The direction was indeed minimal, just 221B Baker Street, and beneath it, in a careful copperplate hand, the detective. No stamp, which meant it had been delivered by private messenger rather than through the Royal Mail. Holmes turned it over in his hands, and Watson could see his friend's eyes cataloguing details. The quality of the paper, the knots in the string, the ink used for the direction, the slight weight and balance of the contents. "Thank you, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes said absently, already moving back toward his chair. "Was the delivery boy still there? Did you happen to notice anything about him?" "Regular messenger service lad," Mrs. Hudson replied. "One of Thompson's boys, I'd say, from the uniform. Couldn't have been more than 12. Said he was paid to deliver it. Nothing more." She paused, then added with the long-suffering patience of one who knew her suggestions would likely be ignored, but felt compelled to make them anyway. You'll be careful opening that, won't you? Some of us would prefer the sitting room remain in one piece. I shall endeavour to preserve the structural integrity of your property, Holmes assured her with gentle amusement, and Mrs. Hudson, recognizing both dismissal and genuine affection in the tone, retreated with a final cautionary look. Watson set aside his newspaper. The sewers of Southwark could wait, and watched as Holmes carefully untied the string, preserving the knots intact, and then unfolded the brown paper wrapping with methodical precision. Inside was not, as one might expect, a book, but rather a neat stack of newspaper clippings, perhaps 20 or 30 of them, cut with careful precision and laid flat between two pieces of stiff cardboard. Clippings, Watson observed, coming to stand beside Holmes's chair to look over his shoulder. But why send newspaper clippings? The more pressing question, Holmes murmured, lifting the top piece of cardboard to reveal the clippings beneath, is why send clippings that have been so thoroughly cleaned? He lifted one between his fingers, holding it to the light. Look, Watson. No dust, no yellowing, no creases from storage. These have been cut quite recently from papers that were themselves quite new, then carefully preserved. And see here. He indicated the edges of the cuts. Scissors, not torn. Clean lines. Someone took considerable care with these. Watson leaned closer. The clippings were indeed pristine, each one a small rectangle of newsprint, cut with almost surgical precision. He picked up one from the top of the stack. A brief notice about a charity auction in Mayfair, dated from 3 days prior. Another reported a minor fire in a warehouse in Limehouse, contained before serious damage occurred. A third detailed the appointment of a new clerk to some obscure government office Watson had never heard of. They seem entirely random, he said, scanning through several more. Different topics, different sections of the paper. Nothing connecting them that I can see. Random? Holmes repeated, his tone suggesting he found the word either insufficient or premature. Perhaps, though one notes they are all from the past fortnight, all from London papers. I see the Times, the Telegraph, the Standard, and all, if I'm not mistaken, from the same section of each paper. Look at the typeface, the column width. These are all from the lower portion of interior pages, the sorts of places where editors bury small notices and minor reports. He spread several clippings out on the table, arranging them with those long, precise fingers, creating a small mosaic of newsprint. Watson studied them, trying to see what Holmes saw, that trick of perception his friend possessed that could find pattern in apparent chaos. There, a notice about a missing dog in Kensington. Here, a brief report on a successful prosecution of a pickpocket in Westminster. Another about repairs to a church roof in Clerkenwell. And yes, now that Holmes had pointed it out, there was a similarity to them, not in content, but in appearance, in the physical nature of the clippings themselves. Same printing shop? Watson ventured. Possibly, Holmes allowed, which was his way of saying yes, while leaving room for additional nuance. The Times has several printers they contract with, but there are subtle variations in the ink quality, the impression of the type. These, he tapped one clipping, then another, these share certain characteristics. The letter E has a slightly worn serif, see? And the spacing is fractionally inconsistent in a very specific way. I would wager these all came from papers produced by the same press, which narrows our field considerably. Watson picked up another clipping, this one about a lecture on Mesopotamian antiquities at the British Museum. "But even if they came from the same printer," he said, thinking aloud the way Holmes had taught him to do, "what does that tell us? And why send them? There's no message, no explanation. Just clippings." "Just clippings," Holmes agreed, but his eyes had that particular gleam that meant he was pleased by the peculiarity of it all, delighted by the oddness in the way some men were delighted by good wine or fine art. Clean clippings, carefully cut and preserved, delivered anonymously on a Sunday afternoon to the detective. One might almost think someone was trying to draw attention to something without quite saying what that something was. He gathered the clippings back into their stack, then rewrapped them in the brown paper, preserving everything exactly as it had arrived. "We'll keep these," he announced, setting the parcel on his desk beside the ribbon with its wax bee. "Two anomalies in one afternoon. That begins to suggest pattern rather than coincidence." Mrs. Hudson returned, this time with a fresh pot of tea and what looked like seed cake, which she set down with the firm efficiency of someone who had decided that if her lodgers were going to spend a Sunday entertaining mysteries, they would at least do so with proper refreshment. "More mystery. Nonsense," she observed, eyeing the rewrapped parcel with mild suspicion. "I suppose we can forget about a peaceful afternoon." "On the contrary," Holmes said, accepting a fresh cup of tea with genuine appreciation, "I find this all quite peaceful. No bodies, no threats, no desperate clients wringing their hands in our sitting room. Just small curiosities arriving at our door like particularly well-mannered puzzles. It's almost restful." Mrs. Hudson made a sound that managed to convey both skepticism and affection in equal measure. "Your idea of restful would give most people palpitations, Mr. Holmes. But since nobody's bleeding on my carpets or shooting holes in my walls, I suppose I'll count my blessings." She paused at the doorway, looking back. "Will you be wanting dinner at the regular time, or should I expect this peaceful mystery of yours to require irregular hours?" "Regular time would be splendid," Watson assured her, recognizing that one of them ought to maintain some allegiance to normalcy. "I suspect we're not going anywhere this evening." After she'd gone, Watson cut himself a piece of seed cake and settled back into his chair, teacup balanced on the arm. The fire had been built up again, and now crackled with renewed enthusiasm, pushing back against the grey chill that the rain kept pressing against the windows. Outside, a hansom cab splashed past, its driver hunched against the weather, and somewhere in the distance a church bell marked the half-hour with sonorous conviction. "Holmes," Watson said after a comfortable silence, "do you really think the two are connected? The cat with the seal and the parcel with the clippings?" Holmes had moved to the window, teacup in hand, and stood looking out at the rain-softened street. "I think," he said slowly, "that Sunday in London is generally a very quiet day. The city rests. Business ceases. Even the criminal classes tend to take the day off, or at least confine themselves to crimes of opportunity, rather than elaborate planning. And yet, this Sunday, two peculiar items have found their way to our door, neither urgent, neither threatening, but both deliberate. Someone is trying to communicate something, Watson, but they're doing it in whispers and symbols rather than straightforward language." "Perhaps they're afraid," Watson suggested. "Perhaps they don't dare approach directly." "Perhaps," Holmes agreed, still gazing out at the rain. "Or perhaps they're testing us. seeing if we'll notice, seeing if we'll pay attention to small things, quiet things, things that don't announce themselves with drama and alarm. He turned back from the window, and Watson saw that his friend's earlier ennui had completely vanished, burned away by the small flame of curiosity that had been lit. This was Holmes, at his most engaged, not by violence or tragedy, but by puzzle, by the intellectual satisfaction of disorder yearning to be ordered, of chaos seeking pattern. "Well," Watson said, reaching for his cake, "I suppose our boring Sunday has become slightly less boring." "My dear Watson," Holmes replied, returning to his chair with something approaching contentment, "I'm beginning to suspect it may become quite interesting indeed, though I do hope Mrs. Hudson's wish will be granted, and we can manage it without any corpses." As if in punctuation, the gaslight in the hallway outside their door flickered, dimmed, then steadied again. Both men glanced toward it, then at each other. "Did you notice," Holmes said quietly, "that it did that exactly 1 hour ago as well?" Watson set down his cake. "I did not." "Neither did I, consciously. But the mind observes even when we don't attend. The gaslight has been flickering at precise intervals, which is, one must admit, quite peculiar for a gas line that's been perfectly reliable for years. A third anomaly, then, small, domestic, easy to overlook, but arriving in sequence, like notes in a melody beginning to reveal itself. The afternoon stretched ahead, rain-soft and mysterious, and the piece of 221B had acquired an edge of curiosity that made it somehow more comfortable rather than less. The afternoon had acquired that particular stillness that arrives when rain has been falling so long it becomes less a weather event and more a state of being, a fundamental quality of the world that one simply accepts the way one accepts gravity or the passage of time. The light, such as it was, had begun its slow autumn decline, not darkening dramatically, but rather fading with the gentleness of something tired and ready for rest. The lamps had been lit throughout 221B, their warm glow pushing back against the encroaching grey, and the fire had been tended twice more by Mrs. Hudson, who seemed determined that if mysteries were going to accumulate in her sitting room, they would at least do so in comfortable warmth. Holmes had spent the better part of an hour in what Watson thought of as his observation mode, that peculiar state where he appeared to be doing absolutely nothing while actually doing a great deal. He had positioned himself in his chair at such an angle that he could see both the hallway gaslight and the mantelpiece clock without moving his head, and had simply waited. Watson had returned to his newspaper, though by now he had read it so thoroughly he could probably recite the sewage article from memory, and was considering whether to begin on the week-old medical journal sitting on the side table, when a knock sounded at the door below. Not Mrs. Hudson's knock. They both knew that pattern, firm and efficient and utterly characteristic. This was heavier, more deliberate, and followed by the sound of their landlady's voice raised in greeting, then footsteps on the stairs that carried the particular rhythm of official purpose. Watson and Holmes exchanged glances. They knew those footsteps too. Inspector Lestrade appeared in the doorway a moment later, looking damp and slightly apologetic, his bowler hat in his hands and his overcoat shedding small droplets onto Mrs. Hudson's floor in a way that would undoubtedly earn a reproachful look later. He was a compact man, professionally neat even when weather-beaten, with sharp eyes that had learned to see more than most, but still knew their limitations, which was perhaps why he was standing in their doorway now, rather than sitting comfortably in his own office at Scotland Yard. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said with a small nod that managed to be both formal and familiar. "I hope I'm not intruding on your Sunday?" "Inspector," Holmes replied, already rising with the fluid grace he brought to anything that interested him. "You are either here for tea, which would be uncharacteristic but welcome, or you have something on your mind that couldn't wait until Monday, which would be characteristic and equally welcome. Please sit. You're dripping on Mrs. Hudson's floor, and she has already declared this a proper Sunday, with no corpses at the table. I'd prefer not to test her patience further by adding water damage to our sins." Lestrade managed a small smile and moved to the chair Holmes indicated, the one closest to the fire. Watson rose to pour tea, a ritual so practiced between them it required no discussion, while Mrs. Hudson appeared with a towel and a look that suggested she had been prepared for exactly this development. "I'll bring fresh tea," she announced, collecting the existing pot, "and something more substantial than cake. Inspector, you look like you've been walking half of London." "Not quite half, Mrs. Hudson," Lestrade said, accepting the towel gratefully and making a cursory effort to dry his coat. "Though it's been a long enough day for a Sunday that's supposed to be restful." Once Mrs. Hudson had departed and Lestrade had been equipped with fresh tea and the promise of food, the inspector settled back in his chair with the air of a man preparing to present something he wasn't entirely certain how to explain. He took a long sip of tea, set the cup down with careful deliberation, and then fixed Holmes with that particular look that meant he was about to ask for help, while maintaining the fiction that he was merely having a casual conversation. "I am here for tea," he began, which both Holmes and Watson recognized as preamble. "But I suppose I'm also here because something odd has been happening at the Yard, and I thought—" He paused, seeming to reconsider his words. "Well, I thought you might find it interesting, or at least I hoped you might." "I'm all attention," Holmes assured him, settling into his own chair with his fingertips pressed together in that characteristic pose Watson had learned meant his friend's mind was fully engaged. "Please, proceed." Lestrade took another fortifying sip of tea. "Over the past week," he said, "Scotland Yard has received 3 separate anonymous tips. Different matters, different crimes, if you can even call them that. Small things, really. A theft of some silverware from a house in Kensington. A bit of fraud involving railway shares. Nothing major, just a clerk skimming small amounts. And a shipment that went missing from a warehouse in Wapping, turned up 3 days later in entirely the wrong building." Watson waited for the peculiar part, because Lestrade would not have walked through Sunday rain to report ordinary anonymous tips, which the Yard received regularly, and most of which led nowhere. "The thing is," Lestrade continued, "each tip was accurate, not just vaguely correct, but precisely so. The first one told us exactly where to find the stolen silver. It was in a pawnshop in Shoreditch, just as the note said. The second gave us the name of the clerk and the specific account he was using. The third told us which building in Wapping, which floor, which room. We followed up on all 3, and in each case we found exactly what the tip said we'd find." "Anonymous tips that are actually useful," Holmes murmured. "That is rather unusual." Most anonymous information is either too vague to be actionable or so specific that it comes from someone directly involved in the crime. Did you investigate the sources? That's the other peculiar thing, Lestrade said, leaning forward slightly. Each tip came by different means. The first was a note left at the front desk at the Yard. The second came by post, regular mail. The third was handed to a constable on the street in Whitechapel by a child who ran off before he could be questioned. Different methods, different handwriting on each one. We checked. But each one. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew 3 small pieces of paper, setting them on the table between them. Each one was signed the same way. Holmes leaned forward, and Watson rose to look over his shoulder. The 3 notes were indeed in different hands. One, a careful copperplate. One, a rougher script suggesting less education. One in block, capitals that might have been deliberately disguised. But at the bottom of each note, in the same position, but undrawn with what appeared to be the same pen, was a small, simple illustration. A bee. The same bee, or near enough, that had been sealed in wax on Marmalade's ribbon. Holmes picked up each note in turn, examining them with that intensity that made the rest of the world fade away. Watson could practically see the wheels turning, the connections being made, the pattern beginning to emerge from what had seemed like unrelated data. A bee, Holmes said softly. Always a bee. And you say these tips were all accurate? To the letter, Lestrade confirmed. Which is why I'm here, Mr. Holmes. Anonymous tips are one thing. Anonymous tips that are all correct and all signed with the same symbol. That suggests someone who knows things they shouldn't know and has reason not to identify themselves directly. I thought perhaps... He trailed off, looking slightly uncomfortable. You thought perhaps I might have some insight, Holmes finished for him, not unkindly. And you would be correct to think so, Inspector, because as it happens, this is not the first bee I've encountered today. Lestrade's eyebrows rose. Oh. Holmes gestured to his desk, where the ribbon with its wax seal still lay. That arrived this morning, attached to a local cat who seemed quite unbothered by the whole affair. And this, he indicated the rewrapped parcel of newspaper clippings, arrived this afternoon, delivered anonymously to the detective. No bee symbol on that one, but the timing is suggestive. 3 anonymous items to your door, 3 anonymous tips to the Yard, Watson said, seeing the pattern now. All within the same time frame. Someone is trying to communicate, but they're doing it through, what would you call it? Symbolic breadcrumbs? Precisely, Watson, Holmes said with evident satisfaction. Someone wishes to convey information, but cannot or will not do so directly. They are intelligent enough to know that accurate information will be taken seriously, careful enough to vary their methods to avoid easy tracing, and peculiar enough to sign their communications with a B. He looked at Lestrade with genuine interest now. Tell me, Inspector, were these tips sent to you specifically, or to Scotland Yard, generally? Generally, Lestrade replied. Different officers received each one initially, though they all found their way to my desk eventually, since we realized they were connected. Why? Because it suggests our anonymous correspondent is not personally familiar with the inner workings of the Yard, Holmes said, his fingers steepled again. Or they would have directed their information more precisely. They're casting a wide net, hoping the right people will pay attention. Similarly, they sent a sealed message to a cat, rather than directly to our door, and newspaper clippings rather than a straightforward letter. They're indirect, cautious, perhaps afraid. Mrs. Hudson returned with a tray bearing sandwiches and more tea, setting it down with the satisfied air of someone who had correctly predicted that a simple Sunday tea would evolve into something requiring more substantial provisions. "Eating," she announced firmly. "All of you. Mystery solving is no excuse for missing dinner, and I'll not have anyone fainting from hunger in my sitting room." "You are a paragon of practical wisdom, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes told her, reaching for a sandwich with surprising obedience. The truth was, Watson knew, that Holmes often forgot to eat when his mind was engaged, but Mrs. Hudson had long ago learned exactly the right tone to cut through even the deepest concentration. Lestrade accepted a sandwich as well, looking marginally more comfortable now that the information had been shared, and he was no longer alone with the puzzle. "So what do we do, Mr. Holmes? Wait for more bees?" "Among other things," Holmes replied, "though I suspect more bees will arrive regardless of whether we wait for them or not. Our correspondent seems quite determined. The question is what they're trying to tell us, and more importantly, why they need to tell us at all." He paused, taking a contemplative bite of his sandwich. "The crimes you mentioned, theft, fraud, missing shipments, all relatively minor, all successfully resolved thanks to the tips. No violence, no harm to persons, just irregularities, small wrongs quietly righted. Thanks to someone who won't identify themselves," Watson added, "which suggests either they're involved and feel guilty, or they know something they're not supposed to know, or they're afraid of what might happen if they came forward openly," Holmes finished, "which brings us back to cautious, careful, and rather creative in their methods." He looked at Lestrade with something approaching warmth. "You were right to come, Inspector. This is interesting, and I suspect it may become more so. If you receive any additional tips with B signatures, I would be grateful if you'd inform me immediately." "Gladly," Lestrade said, the relief evident in his voice. "Though I do hope this doesn't turn into anything too complicated. I'd prefer my Sunday evenings to remain boring." "I believe that ship has sailed," Watson observed mildly, "for all of us." Outside, the rain continued its patient work, and the gaslight in the hall flickered once more, precisely on the hour, as if keeping time with some clock only it could hear. The afternoon had begun its slow surrender to evening, that transitional time when the already grey light didn't so much darken as simply concede defeat to the coming night. The lamps throughout 221B burned steadier now, their glow less supplementary and more necessary, and the fire had been built up once more until it crackled with the satisfied energy of something doing its proper work. Lestrade had departed some 20 minutes earlier, warmer and drier than he'd arrived, with promises to send word immediately should any more B-marked communications arrive at Scotland Yard, and with 3 sandwiches wrapped in paper courtesy of Mrs. Hudson, who believed firmly that bachelor police inspectors working on Sundays needed feeding. Watson had settled into that peculiar state of comfortable alertness that came from knowing something interesting was unfolding, but not yet knowing quite what shape it would take. He had his notebook out now, the one he kept for cases, though whether this qualified as a case yet remained to be seen, and was making brief notes about the day's accumulation of oddities. One cat one ribbon, one wax seal bearing a bee, one parcel containing carefully cleaned newspaper clippings, 3 anonymous tips to Scotland Yard, all accurate, all signed with the same symbol, and one gaslight that flickered with suspicious regularity, which Holmes had now observed 4 times at precisely hourly intervals. Holmes himself had lapsed into what Watson recognized as his analytical silence, that particular quality of stillness, where he appeared to be gazing at nothing while actually reviewing everything, sorting and categorizing the data in whatever complex filing system his extraordinary mind employed. He had one long leg crossed over the other, his fingertips pressed together, his grey eyes unfocused, in that way that meant he was looking not at the sitting room, but at the patterns forming in his thoughts. The knock at the door below, when it came, was so distinctive that both men recognized it instantly. 3 measured raps, neither aggressive nor tentative, delivered with the unhurried confidence of someone who expected to be admitted, and had no doubt whatsoever that they would be. Watson saw Holmes's eyes sharpen, returning from whatever internal landscape they'd been traversing, and the faintest suggestion of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Mycroft," Holmes said simply. "On a Sunday evening," Watson added, because Mycroft Holmes's appearance at Baker Street was unusual enough on ordinary days, but on a Sunday it suggested something that had overcome even his legendary aversion to unnecessary movement. Mrs. Hudson's voice drifted up, surprised but cordial, and then heavier footsteps on the stairs, not hurried, never hurried where Mycroft was concerned, but steady and deliberate. And then the elder Holmes appeared in the doorway, a large figure made larger by his overcoat and the general air of weary irritation he carried like a personal weather system. He removed his hat, surveyed the sitting room and its occupants with those sharp eyes that missed nothing, despite their habitual expression of mild boredom, and sighed with the particular weariness of a man who had been forced to exert himself in ways he found distasteful. "Sherlock," he said by way of greeting. "Dr. Watson. I do hope I'm not interrupting some crucial experiment with tobacco ash, or the 17 varieties of London mud, but I find myself in the unusual position of requiring consultation, and as Sunday evenings are supposedly devoted to rest, I thought I might catch you in an approachable mood." "Mycroft," Holmes replied, with the particular brand of affection that existed only between brothers and manifested primarily as mutual needling. "How kind of you to walk all the way from Pall Mall. I trust the journey hasn't exhausted you beyond recovery. Please, sit before you collapse from the exertion. Watson, perhaps some brandy? My brother looks as though he's travelled to the ends of the earth rather than 20 minutes by cab." 15 by cab, Mycroft corrected, moving to the chair Lestrade had recently vacated, and settling into it with the careful deliberation of a ship coming to anchor. "And yes, Watson, brandy would be most welcome. This wretched rain has found every gap in one's clothing, and one begins to feel rather like a sponge." He accepted the brandy Watson poured with a small nod of thanks, took a measured sip, and then fixed his younger brother with a look that managed to be both stern and slightly amused. "I suppose you know why I'm here?" "I could deduce," Holmes said, his tone light but his eyes keen. "But I suspect you'd prefer to tell me yourself, rather than endure a demonstration of my observational prowess. It has something to do with a bee, I imagine." Mycroft's eyebrows rose fractionally, which for him was equivalent to another man's dramatic start of surprise. "You've seen it, then?" "3 times today," Holmes confirmed. "Once on a ribbon attached to a cat, once implied by a parcel of newspaper clippings, and once, or rather 3 times, on anonymous tips sent to Scotland Yard. Inspector Lestrade was here not half an hour ago, sharing his puzzlement. And now you arrive on a Sunday evening, having roused yourself from whatever comfortable chair you typically occupy at this hour, which suggests the B symbol has crossed your desk as well. The question is, in what context? Mycroft took another sip of brandy, gathering his thoughts with the same methodical precision he brought to everything. "The bee," he said finally, "is not, as you might assume, merely a bee. It is a specific symbol, used within certain branches of the civil service as an internal mark for particular types of memoranda. Nothing dramatic, simply a way of indicating that a document pertains to administrative matters requiring discretionary handling. It's been in use for approximately 7 years, known only to those within the relevant departments, and never, ever used outside official channels." The silence that followed this revelation was broken only by the crackle of the fire and the steady drum of rain against the windows. Watson could see Holmes processing this new information, fitting it into the pattern he'd been constructing, watching the puzzle shift and reshape itself. "Until now," Holmes said quietly. "Until now," Mycroft agreed. 3 days ago, someone in the Home Office received an anonymous note suggesting certain irregularities in the processing of customs documents. The note was accurate. Minor matters, nothing catastrophic, but genuine irregularities that merited attention. The note was signed with a B symbol that matched precisely the mark we use internally. Yesterday, a similar note arrived at the Treasury, pointing out a small accounting discrepancy. Again, accurate. Again, the B. And this morning... He paused, his expression suggesting distaste at having to discuss work on the Sabbath. "This morning, one arrived at my own office, pointing to what amounts to a clerical error in the filing of certain foreign correspondence." "Also accurate," Watson ventured. "Maddeningly so," Mycroft confirmed. "Which presents us with a rather delicate problem. Someone outside the civil service is using an internal symbol to communicate information they should not possess about matters they should not be privy to. They're not making threats, not demanding anything, simply correcting errors, like a particularly officious schoolmaster marking homework." Holmes had risen and was pacing now, that restless energy that overtook him when his mind was racing ahead of the conversation. "Not just the civil service," he said. "They've also been providing information to Scotland Yard about minor crimes and sending cryptic messages to Baker Street. They're casting a wide net, Mycroft. They're trying to reach anyone who might listen, might act, might pay attention to what they're saying without necessarily knowing who's saying it. The question," Mycroft said, "is what they want. And more pressingly, how they came by both the information they're sharing and the knowledge of our internal symbols. The latter concerns me more than the former, I confess. If our internal marks have been compromised, if someone unauthorized has access to them." "You fear a security breach," Holmes interrupted, still pacing. "You fear someone with access who shouldn't have it. Someone inside your bureaucratic machinery who's developed a conscience or a grudge or simply a compulsion to correct perceived wrongs." "Precisely." Mycroft shifted in his chair, his discomfort evident. "And because the matters they're pointing out are all, technically, genuine problems, and because they've made no demands and issued no threats, I cannot simply dismiss them as the work of a crank. But I also cannot have unauthorized persons using official symbols and demonstrating knowledge of internal affairs. It creates—" He paused, searching for the word. "Uncertainty, which is what bureaucracies fear most," Holmes observed, not unkindly. "Even more than actual harm, you fear the uncertainty of not knowing who knows what. It offends your sense of proper order." He stopped his pacing and turned to face his brother directly. "What do you want me to do?" "Find them," Mycroft said simply. "Determine who's doing this and why, and do it quietly, before this escalates into something requiring official investigation and all the attendant complications. I'd prefer to resolve this as a private matter, if possible." He finished his brandy and set the glass down with finality. "Can you do that without leaving your sitting room? I know how you prefer to avoid actual legwork when possible." The jibe was affectionate, as such things went between them, and Holmes smiled with genuine amusement. "As it happens, I believe I can. All the data I need is already here, or will be shortly. Someone has gone to considerable trouble to send me information today, and I have a strong suspicion the answer lies not in pursuing them, but in understanding what they've already told me." "Then I'll leave you to it," Mycroft said, rising with the same careful deliberation he'd used in sitting. "But, Sherlock, be careful. Someone who knows as much as this person appears to know, who has access to information they shouldn't possess. They may be in danger themselves, even if they don't realize it. Or worse, they may be dangerous." "I don't think so," Holmes said, his voice thoughtful. "Everything about this suggests someone timid, cautious, afraid to approach directly. They're using symbols and intermediaries and elaborate indirection because they're frightened. They're not trying to threaten or extort. They're trying to be heard without being seen." He looked at his brother with something approaching warmth. "Oh, don't worry, Mycroft. I suspect this particular mystery will resolve itself quite peacefully, possibly before you've made it back to your chair at the Diogenes Club." "One hopes," Mycroft replied, moving toward the door. "Mrs. Hudson's stairs seem to have grown steeper since my last visit. Please give her my regards and my apologies for disrupting her Sunday evening." After he'd gone, his footsteps retreating down the stairs and Mrs. Hudson's voice bidding him good night drifting up, Watson looked at Holmes with the question already forming. "You know who it is," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I know the shape of them," Holmes replied, returning to his chair with visible satisfaction. "Someone inside the civil service, someone junior enough to feel powerless, but observant enough to notice irregularities. Someone who learned about the B symbol through their work, but lacks the authority to report problems through proper channels, or fears the consequences of doing so. Someone who has decided that if they cannot be heard directly, they will be heard indirectly by everyone who might possibly listen. But why the cat? Why the newspaper clippings?" Holmes smiled. "Practice, Watson. Building courage, testing methods, and perhaps—" He paused, looking toward the window, where rain still traced patterns down the glass. "Perhaps also simply making sure someone was paying attention, making sure that somewhere in London someone was actually listening." The gaslight in the hall flickered, again right on schedule, and this time Holmes barely glanced at it. The pattern was established. Now it was simply a matter of understanding what the pattern meant. Evening had fully settled over London now, the city wrapped in its familiar cocoon of rain and lamplight, and the particular darkness that was never quite complete, the way it might be in the countryside. Even at night, London glowed with 1,000 scattered points of illumination, gas lamps on street corners, windows lit from within, the occasional flash of a match being struck, the moving lights of hansom cabs carrying their passengers through the wet streets. From the windows of 221B, Watson could see the soft halos that formed around each street lamp, the rain turning light into something almost tangible, something that seemed to hang suspended in the air like luminous fog. Mrs. Hudson had brought up dinner, a proper roast with vegetables, which she'd clearly been planning regardless of how the day's mysteries unfolded, accompanied by her pointed observation that mysteries or no mysteries, gentlemen still need to eat like civilized people. They had eaten. Holmes, with surprising focus for a man whose mind was obviously elsewhere, and Watson, with the comfortable satisfaction of someone who had long ago learned to appreciate Mrs. Hudson's cooking as one of the great constants in an often inconstant world. Now the dishes had been cleared, fresh tea had been provided, and the evening had settled into that quality of time that felt suspended, held between the day's end and sleep's beginning. Holmes had not moved from his chair since Mycroft's departure, except to eat, and even that had been accomplished with a kind of mechanical efficiency that suggested his body was simply maintaining itself, while his mind conducted more important business elsewhere. Now he sat with his eyes closed, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his breathing slow and regular in a way that might have suggested sleep to anyone who didn't know him better. Watson knew better. This was Holmes at his most intensely active, reviewing data, constructing theories, testing them against observed facts, discarding what didn't fit and refining what did. Watson had learned, over their years together, that this process could not be hurried and should not be interrupted. His role in these moments was simply to be present, to provide the companionship that Holmes would never admit to needing, but clearly did, and to be ready when his friend finally surfaced from whatever depths he was exploring. So Watson sat with his own tea and a medical journal he was making a sincere effort to read, though his attention kept drifting to the various objects arrayed on Holmes's desk. The ribbon with its wax bee, the parcel of newspaper clippings, the 3 notes from Lestrade with their drawn symbols. The fire crackled and settled. Rain continued its endless percussion against the windows. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked with metronomic precision, and somewhere in the building a board creaked as it settled for the night. London, vast and complicated and full of secrets, continued its existence beyond their walls, oblivious to the small puzzle being solved in a sitting room on Baker Street. Then Holmes opened his eyes, and Watson set aside his journal, recognizing the shift. "I've been approaching this incorrectly," Holmes announced, his voice thoughtful rather than dramatic. "I've been treating these as separate communications, when in fact they're all part of a single message, delivered in stages because the sender lacks the courage or the means to deliver it all at once." "Go on," Watson encouraged, settling more comfortably into his chair. Holmes rose and moved to his desk, not with his earlier restless energy, but with purposeful calm, the energy of a man who had found his path and was now simply following it to its conclusion. He picked up the ribbon first, holding it to the light, examining the wax seal with the kind of attention most men reserved for religious texts or love letters. "This came first," he said. "A cat arrives at our door wearing a ribbon with a wax seal bearing a bee. Why a cat? Because a cat is untreatable, unquestionable, innocent. No one would stop a cat or demand to know its business. It's the perfect courier for someone who wants to send a message but fears direct contact. And the wax." He brought it closer to his nose, inhaling carefully. "The wax has a particular scent. Not just sealing wax, but sealing wax scented with something sandalwood, I think, or something similar. A luxury touch, the sort of thing available only from better stationers. The sort of place that might keep records of their customers." He set down the ribbon and picked up the parcel of newspaper clippings, unwrapping it once more and spreading the clippings across his desk. These came second, carefully cut, carefully preserved, carefully selected. "Watson, fetch me the magnifying glass, would you?" Watson complied, and Holmes bent over the clippings with intense concentration, examining not their content, but their physical properties. "You see here," he said, indicating a particular clipping, "the wear pattern on this typeface. The letter E with the damaged serif, the slightly uneven spacing. I remarked on it earlier. These all came from the same press, or at least the same shop that uses that particular press." He straightened, his eyes bright now, with the satisfaction of pieces falling into place. "There are perhaps a dozen printing establishments in London that produce newspapers, fewer still that would show this particular pattern of wear. And the locations mentioned in these clippings?" He picked up several, scanning them quickly. "Clerkenwell, Whitechapel, Southwark, Limehouse, all areas served primarily by local papers, but these are from the major dailies. Someone collected these specifically from papers printed in a particular shop, which suggests either they work there or they have regular access to it." "But what do the clippings mean?" Watson asked. "What are they telling us?" "Nothing," Holmes said, with evident satisfaction at the paradox. "Or rather, everything. They're not about their content, Watson. They're about their existence. Someone is saying, I have access to these newspapers. I know how to select information. I understand how printing works. I'm careful and methodical and patient. It's not a message about what's in the papers. It's a message about the person who sent them." He set the clippings down and moved to the 3 notes from Lestrade, examining them with the same focused attention. "Different handwriting on each," he murmured. "But look at the paper quality. All good quality. All from the same supplier. You can tell by the watermark. Very faint, but consistent. And the B symbols, while drawn by hand rather than stamped, show remarkable consistency in their proportions. Someone practiced drawing these, got them perfect, then reproduced them carefully on each note." He looked up at Watson. "This is someone who works with documents, Watson. Someone who handles paper and ink and official correspondence regularly. Someone who has developed an eye for detail because their work demands it." Watson felt the pieces beginning to align in his own mind now, the pattern emerging from what had seemed like random elements. "Someone in the civil service," he said. "Someone junior, as you said earlier. Someone who sees irregularities but lacks the authority to address them directly." "Precisely." Holmes returned to his chair, bringing the notes with him, arranging them in sequence on the small table beside him. "Now, the tips to Scotland Yard and to Mycroft's office. All accurate, all pointing to small irregularities, nothing major, nothing catastrophic, but genuine problems that needed addressing. Not the work of someone trying to cause chaos, but of someone trying to fix things, to make corrections, to set matters right. He picked up one of the notes, the one that had gone to Scotland Yard about the missing shipment. This mentions a warehouse in Wapping, specific building, specific floor. That level of detail suggests someone with access to shipping records or customs documents. And this one, he indicated another, about the railway share fraud, mentions specific account numbers, someone with access to financial records, or at least to correspondence about them. But how would a junior clerk have access to all of that? Watson objected. Surely different departments handle different types of information. Ah, Holmes said, and his smile was the smile of a man who had just reached the heart of the puzzle. But what if this person's job is precisely to handle correspondence between departments? What if they're a filing clerk, or a messenger, or someone who processes internal memoranda? They would see everything, Watson. They would be invisible, ignored, considered part of the furniture. And yet, they would have access to information from every corner of the bureaucratic machinery. And they would learn the internal symbols, like the B, because part of their job would be recognizing and routing documents that bore such marks. Watson leaned forward, caught up in the logic of it. So they see irregularities, but they're too junior to report them directly. They fear they won't be believed, or worse, they'll be blamed for noticing what they shouldn't have noticed. Exactly so. And being methodical and careful by nature and training, they devise a plan. They will report the irregularities, but indirectly, anonymously. They will use the symbols they've learned to lend credibility to their reports. They will send information to multiple sources, Scotland Yard, the civil service departments, even to me, ensuring that someone, somewhere, will pay attention and act. Holmes set down the notes and picked up the ribbon again, turning it over in his fingers. And they will test their methods first, with small communications that establish pattern and credibility, before they reveal whatever it is they most need to reveal. The cat and the clippings, Watson said. Practice runs. Practice runs, Holmes confirmed. Building courage, testing methods, ensuring the communication channels work. And there's one more thing. He gestured toward the hallway. The gaslight. It's been flickering at precise hourly intervals since early afternoon. Not a malfunction, Watson. Gas lines don't malfunction with that kind of regularity. Someone is controlling it, probably from the street level, briefly reducing the gas flow at specific times. Why? Watson considered this. Another signal? Another way of saying, I'm here, I'm watching, pay attention? Or perhaps, Holmes said softly, a way of saying I'm frightened. I'm not sure I have the courage to come forward, but I'm still here, still trying. The gaslight flickers like a heartbeat, regular and persistent. Someone reminding themselves, and us, that they haven't given up. He rose and moved to the window, looking out at the rain-dark street. They're out there now, I'd wager. Somewhere nearby, watching our windows, trying to gauge whether we're paying attention, whether we understand. They've sent their messages, laid their trail, and now they're waiting to see if anyone follows it. Should we go out? Watson asked, already half rising. Try to find them? No, Holmes said firmly. That would only frighten them further. They've gone to all this trouble to maintain distance, to stay anonymous. If we chase them, they'll bolt. We need to invite them in, make them feel safe enough to approach." He turned from the window, and Watson saw that his expression was gentle, almost kind, an expression Holmes reserved for victims rather than villains, for the frightened rather than the threatening. "Watson," he said, "would you be so good as to place a lamp in the window? And perhaps write a brief note, something simple. Your messages are received. You are safe here. Please come to 221B at your convenience. S.H. We'll put it in the window as well, where it can be seen from the street." Watson did as requested, fetching a lamp and positioning it carefully, then writing the note in clear, firm letters on a piece of paper large enough to be read from outside. He placed it in the window, securing it so it wouldn't fall, and then stepped back to examine the effect. The lamp cast a warm glow, and the note was clearly visible, an invitation rather than a demand. "And now?" he asked. "Now we wait," Holmes replied, returning to his chair with evident satisfaction. "We've solved the puzzle, Watson. Now we simply need to meet the puzzler. They'll come, I think. Perhaps not tonight, but soon. They've worked too hard to establish communication to abandon it now, and we've shown them we're listening, which is all they wanted in the first place." He picked up his violin, settling it beneath his chin with familiar ease, and began to play. Nothing elaborate, just a simple melody, something calm and welcoming, the sort of music that might drift from a window on a rainy evening and sound like safety, like home, like a place where someone frightened might finally find the courage to seek help. Watson returned to his chair, his journal, and his comfortable vigil. The fire burned steady. The rain continued its patient work, and somewhere in the London night, someone anonymous and frightened saw a lamp burning in a Baker Street window and perhaps, just perhaps, began walking toward it. The evening stretched ahead, full of possibility and rain and the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle well solved, waiting only for its final piece to arrive. The evening had deepened into that particular hour when the city's rhythm changed, when the hurried footsteps of people rushing home had given way to the slower, more deliberate movements of those whose business with the night was just beginning. The rain had finally begun to ease, not stopping entirely, but shifting from its earlier persistence to something lighter, almost apologetic, as though it had made its point and could now afford to be gentle. The lamp in the window continued its steady glow, and Holmes's violin had moved through several melodies, each one softer and more meditative than the last, until finally he had set the instrument aside and simply waited, patient as the rain. Watson had been making notes in his journal, not the dry clinical notes of his medical practice, but the more narrative style he employed when documenting their cases, though he still wasn't certain this qualified as a case in the traditional sense. No crime, really. No victim. Just a series of small mysteries arranged like breadcrumbs leading to a person who wanted to be found, but was too frightened to simply knock on the door. He had just finished describing the lamp in the window, when Holmes suddenly straightened, his head tilting slightly in that way that meant he'd heard something Watson had not yet registered. A moment later, Watson heard it too. Footsteps on the stairs, but not Mrs. Hudson's familiar tread. These were lighter, more hesitant, and they paused several times, as though their owner was reconsidering with each step. Then a soft knock at the door, barely audible, the kind of knock that suggested its maker hoped perhaps no one would hear it, and they could retreat with their courage intact. "Come in," Holmes called, his voice deliberately gentle, the tone one might use with a nervous animal or a frightened child. "Please, you're quite expected, and entirely welcome." The door opened slowly, and a young man appeared in the doorway, looking as though he might bolt at any sudden movement. He was perhaps 20 years old, thin and pale in the way of people who spent their days indoors under gaslight, dressed in the respectable but inexpensive clothing of a junior clerk, a suit that had been good quality once, but showed the careful mending of someone who couldn't afford to replace it. His hair was neatly combed, his collar clean, his shoes polished despite the rain, all the small signs of someone who took pride in their appearance even when circumstances made it difficult. But it was his eyes that caught Watson's attention, large and dark, and carrying the particular weariness of someone who had been carrying a burden too heavy for their shoulders. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, and even in those two words Watson could hear the accent of someone educated beyond their station, the careful diction of a person determined to be taken seriously. I saw your lamp, and the note. I'm sorry to disturb you so late. I know it's an imposition, but You're not disturbing us at all," Holmes said, rising with fluid grace and gesturing to the chair closest to the fire. "Please sit. You must be cold from standing in the rain. Watson, would you pour our guest some tea? Or perhaps something stronger? You look as though you could use it, Mr. Pemberton," the young man supplied, moving into the room with the cautious steps of someone entering unfamiliar territory. "Thomas Pemberton, and tea would be— Yes, thank you. That's very kind." He sat in the offered chair, as though afraid it might not hold him, perched on the edge with his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his eyes darting between Holmes and Watson, as though trying to assess whether he'd made a terrible mistake. Watson poured tea with practiced ease, adding sugar without asking, because the young man looked as though he needed it, and handed him the cup with the same gentle manner he would use with a patient in shock. Pemberton took it gratefully, wrapping both hands around the warmth, and seemed to draw some comfort from it. "You've been very clever, Mr. Pemberton," Holmes said, returning to his own chair and settling into it, with deliberate casualness, making himself less imposing through posture alone. The cat, the newspaper clippings, the various anonymous communications, all very carefully planned and executed. You have a methodical mind and considerable resourcefulness. Pemberton's eyes widened slightly. You know it was me? But how could you possibly— "Because you left precisely the trail you intended to leave," Holmes interrupted gently. "Not through carelessness, but through careful design. You wanted to be found, but only by someone patient enough and attentive enough to follow the breadcrumbs. Someone who would understand that you were frightened, but sincere, cautious, but honest. Someone who would take you seriously despite your youth and your position." He leaned forward slightly, his expression kind. "You work in the civil service, don't you? Something to do with correspondence or filing?" Pemberton confirmed, his voice growing slightly steadier now that the initial terror of arrival had passed. "In the Home Office, I process internal memoranda, route correspondence between departments, maintain filing systems. It's not important work, not really. I'm just part of the machinery. Nobody notices clerks like me. We're supposed to be invisible." "But invisible people see things," Watson observed quietly, "that others might miss. Pemberton's eyes met Watson's, and there was such relief in them that Watson felt his heart contract with sympathy. "Yes," the young man said. "Yes, exactly. I see everything, Dr. Watson. Every piece of paper that moves between departments crosses my desk at some point. Shipping manifests, financial reports, personnel records, customs documents. I'm supposed to simply file them, mark them with the appropriate routing symbols, send them on their way. I'm not supposed to read them, not really. Not supposed to think about them." "But you did," Holmes said, and it wasn't a question. "I did." Pemberton set down his teacup, his hands trembling slightly. "At first it was just mistakes. Small errors in filing, documents miscategorized, that sort of thing. I corrected them, because that's my job. But then I started noticing patterns, things that weren't just mistakes, but deliberate. Small amounts of money going missing from accounts, shipments being redirected, records being altered just slightly, not enough that anyone would notice unless they were looking very carefully. An embezzlement scheme, Holmes said thoughtfully. Small scale, carefully managed, spread across multiple departments, so no single person would notice the full extent of it." Pemberton nodded miserably. "I wasn't sure at first. I thought perhaps I was imagining things, seeing patterns that weren't really there. So I started keeping my own records, copying things down, tracking the discrepancies. And the more I tracked, the more certain I became. Someone, or several someones, was stealing from the government, not large amounts, nothing that would trigger audits or investigations, but steady, consistent theft over months, possibly years. "Why didn't you report it through proper channels?" Watson asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Because I'm nobody," Pemberton said, his voice carrying a bitterness that seemed too old for his young face. "I'm a junior clerk, barely 6 months in my position. Who would believe me? And worse." He paused, swallowing hard. "Some of the documents I saw bore the signatures of senior officials. What if they were involved? What if reporting it through official channels meant reporting it to the very people committing the crimes? I'd be dismissed, probably blacklisted, unable to find other work. Or worse." Holmes nodded slowly. "So you devised another way. You would report the irregularities, but anonymously. You would use the B symbol, which you'd learned was a mark for discretionary handling, to lend your reports credibility. You would send information to multiple recipients. Scotland Yard for the criminal matters, the civil service departments for the internal irregularities, and to me, as a supposedly neutral party who might investigate independently." "I didn't know if it would work," Pemberton admitted. "I thought perhaps everyone would ignore anonymous tips, dismiss them as pranks or time wasters. But I had to try something. I couldn't just know about it and do nothing. That would make me complicit, wouldn't it? Even if I was too frightened to speak openly, I had to find some way to speak." "The cat was a test," Holmes said gently. "A way of seeing if I would pay attention to small, peculiar things." "Mrs. Hendricks's marmalade is very friendly," Pemberton said with a ghost of a smile. "He let me tie the ribbon quite easily. I thought if you noticed something as small as a seal on a cat's collar, you'd notice the rest. And if you didn't, well, no harm done. Just a cat with an odd accessory." "And the newspaper clippings?" Watson asked. "Practice, mostly," Pemberton admitted. "I work with documents all day. I thought if I sent you clippings, clean, carefully preserved, showing attention to detail, you might understand that whoever sent them was meticulous, organized, credible, not a crank or a madman, but someone who knew how to handle information properly. It was well thought out, Holmes said, and there was genuine approval in his voice. You showed considerable ingenuity, Mr. Pemberton. But I confess I'm curious about one thing. Why wait until now to come forward? You've established your credibility, sent your messages, drawn attention to the problems. Why not simply send us a letter explaining everything? Pemberton looked down at his hands, and when he spoke, his voice was very small. Because I'm a coward, he said. Because every time I thought about actually approaching you, actually revealing myself, I became terrified. What if you didn't believe me? What if you thought I was the one committing the crimes, trying to deflect blame? What if... He trailed off, then looked up again. But then I saw your lamp tonight, and your note. You are safe here. And I thought perhaps I'd been frightened long enough. Perhaps it was time to be brave, even if I didn't feel brave. Watson felt a swell of protective anger on the young man's behalf, anger at a system that made someone doing the right thing feel like a criminal, that forced honesty into shadows and courage into anonymity. You've been very brave already, he said firmly. What you've done took considerable courage, even if you don't feel it. Many men in your position would have simply looked away. Watson's right, Holmes added. You've done well, Mr. Pemberton, and I want you to understand something. You're safe here. Whatever happens next, whatever we discover about this scheme you've uncovered, you will be protected. You have my word on that, and Dr. Watson's, and I promise you it's a word we take seriously. Pemberton's eyes glistened suspiciously, and he blinked rapidly, looking away. Thank you, he managed. Thank you. I don't think you know what that means to me. Now then, Holmes said briskly, shifting into his practical mode. Let's discuss the specifics of what you've discovered. Watson, fetch your notebook. I believe Mr. Pemberton has quite a story to tell us, and we'll need to document it carefully. Outside, the rain had stopped entirely, and London was settling into the quiet that came in those brief hours between evening and true night. Inside 221B, in the warm glow of lamp and firelight, a frightened young clerk began to speak, and two men listened with the kind of attention that said, "You matter. Your words matter. You were right to come here." And sometimes, Watson thought, that was all courage really needed, someone willing to listen. The story that Thomas Pemberton told took the better part of an hour to unfold properly, and it emerged not in one coherent narrative, but in pieces, fragments that Holmes patiently assembled like a man working a jigsaw puzzle, where all the pieces were the same shade of grey. There were names Watson dutifully recorded in his notebook, though Holmes assured Pemberton they would be handled with discretion. There were account numbers, document references, dates that formed a pattern of small thefts spread across months. Nothing dramatic. No one would write sensational headlines about this. But genuine nonetheless, a slow bleeding of public funds into private pockets, the kind of crime that relied on being too small to notice, too boring to investigate. The architect of it all, as Pemberton had pieced together from his invisible vantage point among the filing cabinets and correspondence routing, appeared to be a mid-level supervisor named Wickham, a man who had spent 20 years in the civil service and had learned precisely where the cracks were, where money could slip through unnoticed if one was patient and careful. He hadn't worked alone. There were at least 2 others involved, one in customs, one in the treasury. But Wickham was the centre, the spider, in a very small, very careful web. He seemed so ordinary, Pemberton said at one point, his voice carrying a note of bewilderment. I filed his correspondence every day. He was always polite, always proper. He remembered my name, asked after my mother when she was ill. I never would have suspected him if I hadn't noticed the patterns in the documents. The best criminals often seem the most ordinary, Holmes observed gently. It's the flamboyant ones who get caught. The quiet, methodical ones can go for years undetected. He had been making his own notes as Pemberton spoke, occasionally asking clarifying questions, his expression thoughtful, but not alarmed. This was Holmes in his element, not the dramatic confrontations or dangerous pursuits that sometimes characterized their work, but the patient unravelling of deception through careful attention to detail. By the time Pemberton had finished, exhaustion was evident in every line of his thin frame. He slumped in his chair like a puppet whose strings had been cut. The relief of finally sharing his burden, warring with the fear of what came next. Holmes set aside his notes and regarded the young man with something approaching paternal concern, which was remarkable, given that Holmes was not generally given to paternal anything. "Here's what we're going to do," Holmes said, his tone decisive but kind. "Watson and I will contact Inspector Lestrade at Scotland Yard tomorrow morning. We'll present him with your information, but we'll do so in a way that keeps your name out of it as much as possible. Lestrade is a good man and a careful investigator. He'll know how to handle this quietly, how to gather the necessary evidence without alarming the guilty parties prematurely. And more importantly," he leaned forward, ensuring he had Pemberton's full attention, "we'll make certain you're protected. You'll be a witness, yes, but a protected one. No retaliation, no blacklisting, no consequences for having done the right thing." "But my position," Pemberton said anxiously. "I can't lose my position. My mother depends on my income, and positions are hard to come by." "Your position is secure," Holmes interrupted firmly. "In fact, I rather suspect that once this matter is resolved and the embezzlement scheme dismantled, there will be several positions opening up in your department. And the people investigating this matter will need someone they can trust, someone who has demonstrated both integrity and exceptional attention to detail. I shouldn't be surprised if you find yourself rather better situated 6 months from now than you are currently." Watson watched the hope dawn slowly on Pemberton's face, watched the young man struggle to believe that doing the right thing might not, in fact, lead to ruin. "You really think so?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "I know so," Holmes said with conviction. "And if I'm wrong, which I'm not, but if I were, you have my personal assurance that neither you nor your mother will suffer for your honesty. I have some influence in certain quarters, Mr. Pemberton. I will use it on your behalf, if necessary." The knock at the door came then, and Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a tray with fresh tea, and what appeared to be the remainder of the seed cake from earlier, along with several sandwiches. She took in the scene, the exhausted young clerk, the scattered notes, the general air of serious conversation having reached some resolution, and smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose instincts about such things were rarely wrong. "I thought you might all need sustenance," she said, setting the tray down with practised efficiency. And Mr. Pemberton, that is your name, isn't it? I heard it mentioned. Mook, you look as though you haven't eaten properly in days. You'll have some cake and sandwiches before you leave, and I'll not hear any arguments about it. Thank you, Mrs. Hudson, Pemberton managed, and Watson saw the young man's eyes grow suspiciously bright again at this simple kindness from a woman who had no reason to care about him except that he was in her sitting room and looked like he needed feeding. And I'll tell you something else, Mrs. Hudson continued, her tone taking on that particular firmness she employed when making pronouncements about the proper way things ought to be. I've lived in this house long enough to know when good people are trying to do right by difficult situations. You struck me as a good person the moment I saw you on my doorstep, all nervous and wet from the rain. You'll have no trouble from anyone in this house, and if anyone gives you trouble elsewhere, you'll let Mr. Holmes know about it. He's not as fierce as he sometimes pretends, but he's very good at managing people who need managing. After she'd departed, Pemberton ate with the focus of someone who had indeed not been eating properly, anxiety having done its usual work on appetite. Holmes and Watson kept him company, the conversation shifting to lighter matters, how long he'd been in London, what he thought of the city, whether he had friends or interests outside his work. Gradually, the terrible tension that had been holding the young man rigid began to ease, and he even managed a few smiles, particularly when Watson told a carefully edited story about one of their earlier cases that had involved a missing parrot and a very confused magistrate. It was nearly 10 o'clock when Pemberton finally rose to leave, steadier now, fed and warmed, and no longer looking quite so much like a man facing the gallows. Holmes walked him to the door, and Watson followed, both of them understanding without discussion that young Pemberton needed to be seen off properly, needed to know that this wasn't the end of their concern for him. Come to Baker Street tomorrow afternoon, Holmes instructed as they reached the front door. Around 2 o'clock. By then, I'll have spoken with Lestrade and arranged for you to give a formal statement. I'll be with you when you do, and so will Watson if he's available. You won't be alone in this, Mr. Pemberton. Not any more. Pemberton shook both their hands with evident emotion, started to speak, seemed to find words inadequate, and finally just nodded and stepped out into the night. They watched until he'd reached the corner and disappeared into the streets of London, one more anonymous figure among millions, except that now he was no longer quite so alone. Back in the sitting room, Watson sank into his chair with a satisfied sigh. That poor young man, he said. He was terrified. He had reason to be, Holmes replied, moving to the window and closing the curtains against the night. The civil service protects its own, and that includes protecting its secrets. Coming forward required considerable courage, more than he probably knew he possessed. He paused, looking back at the room, the scattered notes, the evidence of the day's small mysteries now solved, the lingering warmth of companionship and tea. But he did come forward. That's the important thing. Mrs. Hudson appeared one final time, this time to collect the tea things and give the room that assessing look she employed when determining whether her lodgers were going to require anything else or could be safely left to their own devices. So nobody died then? She asked, echoing her morning pronouncement. No bodies, no violence, just a frightened boy with a good heart and a problem too big to carry alone. No bodies, Holmes confirmed with evident satisfaction. Just a small puzzle solved and a young man helped. A very proper Sunday, all things considered. Proper, Mrs. Hudson repeated, her tone suggesting she had her own opinions about what constituted proper, but she smiled none the less. "Well, I'm glad for it. That Mr. Pemberton seems like a nice boy. I hope things work out for him." "They will," Holmes assured her. "I'll see to it." After she'd gone, taking the tea things with her, the sitting room settled into the particular quiet that came at day's end, that sense of tasks completed and rest earned. The fire had burned down to coals again, that perfect state it had occupied that morning, and the rain had stopped entirely, leaving London washed clean and temporarily peaceful. Watson could hear the distant sound of a church bell marking the hour, and somewhere a dog barked once and fell silent. Holmes had returned to his chair and picked up his violin, but he didn't play, just held it as he had that morning, his eyes distant and thoughtful. "You know, Watson," he said after a long silence, "I complained this morning about the tedium of idleness, about Sundays being boring." "I remember," Watson said, smiling slightly. "Mrs. Hudson declared it a proper Sunday with no corpses." "She did indeed," Holmes agreed. "And yet, here we are at the end of this supposedly boring Sunday, and we've encountered mysterious cats and anonymous clippings and gaslight signals and frightened clerks uncovering embezzlement schemes. We've had visits from Lestrade and Mycroft. We've solved a puzzle, helped someone in genuine need, and done it all without leaving these rooms." He finally looked at Watson, and there was genuine contentment in his expression. It's been, in its own quiet way, rather a perfect day. Watson had to agree. There was something deeply satisfying about this kind of case, if case it could be called. No violence, no danger, no desperate races against time. Just observation and deduction and patience, just listening to someone who needed to be heard and helping them find their courage, just, in the end, a small wrong being set right, and a young man being given the protection he deserved for, doing the difficult, frightening work of honesty. "What will happen to Wickham and his associates?" Watson asked, "when Lestrade investigates?" "They'll be arrested, quietly," Holmes said. "Tried, convicted, imprisoned. The civil service will be quietly embarrassed, will implement new oversight procedures, will promote young Pemberton to a position where his attention to detail can be properly utilized. In 6 months, this will be forgotten by everyone except those directly involved." He paused, then added thoughtfully, "Which is as it should be. Not every story needs to be dramatic. Sometimes the quiet victories are the most important ones." Watson nodded, thinking about Pemberton's face when Holmes had promised his protection, the relief that had flooded through the young man like light through a window. "He called himself a coward," he said. "But he wasn't, was he? He was quite brave." "Very brave," Holmes agreed. "The quiet kind of bravery that doesn't get celebrated in newspapers, or commemorated with medals, but bravery nonetheless. The bravery of continuing to do what's right, even when you're terrified, even when you're alone, even when you have no certainty that anyone will listen or help." He set the violin aside with finality. "That's the kind that counts most, I think." Outside, London continued its vast, complicated existence. 8 million people pursuing their separate lives, most of them never knowing that in a sitting room on Baker Street, a small mystery had been solved, and a frightened young man had found unexpected allies. The city kept its secrets and told its lies and turned its great wheel. And somewhere among all those millions, Thomas Pemberton was walking home through streets no longer quite so lonely, knowing that tomorrow he wouldn't have to face his fear alone. Inside 221B, the fire burned low and warm, and the two men who lived there settled into that comfortable silence that came with years of friendship and shared purpose. Watson would write this case up eventually, he thought, though it would never be one of the dramatic ones, never be one that readers demanded to hear. But it mattered. In its own quiet way, it mattered very much. Mrs. Hudson was right, he said aloud. It was a proper Sunday. The best kind, Holmes replied, and in the warmth of lamplight and friendship, in the safety of home, and the satisfaction of work well done, even the great detective seemed content to simply sit and let the evening settle around them like a comfortable blanket. The clock struck the half-hour. The fire sighed and shifted. Rain began again, very softly, tapping at the windows like an old friend returning. And in the sitting room at 221B Baker Street, where mysteries both grand and small found their resolution, Sunday came to its peaceful close. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Lestrade would need to be briefed, statements would need to be taken, justice would need to be carefully served. But tomorrow could wait. Tonight was for rest, for tea and firelight, and the particular contentment that came from knowing that even boring Sunday afternoons could hide neat little puzzles, and that solving them sometimes meant simply listening when someone finally found the courage to speak. Watson picked up his journal one last time and added a final note. Sometimes the best cases are the quiet ones. Sometimes the greatest victories are won, not with drama, but with patience, not with action, but with attention, not with grand gestures, but with simple kindness. Today was such a case. Today was such a victory, and I find myself grateful for it. He closed the journal, set it aside, and let himself simply be. Here, now, in this moment of peace at the end of an anything but boring Sunday afternoon. And that, he thought, was really all one could ask for.